Welcome to another episode of End of United States of America as World Superpower. On today's episode on Life Facts Daily, we're looking at the fallout if America loses its position as a superpower. And this leads us to a terrifying question. If America collapses at home while losing influence abroad, could the United States itself break apart? It may sound impossible, but history whispers otherwise. Rome didn't fall in a single night, it fractured. The Soviet Union collapsed, not because of foreign armies, but because of internal rot. Could the same happen to the US? Could the very idea of one nation, under God, indivisible, come to an end? This is what happens if the US loses its place as the world's most dominant power. And it could happen sooner than you expect. That's the haunting possibility we'll explore. First, what exactly is a superpower? The term gets thrown around a lot by the media, and it's almost never used correctly. Today, various media outlets often refer to the US, Russia, and China as superpowers. But this is wrong. The world only has one superpowers, and it's the United States of America. Geopolitically, though, since the end of the Cold War, and arguably through much of the second half, there's only ever been one superpower, the United States. So, what exactly makes America an overpowered character on the global stage? The answer lies in various different facets of the modern US. A true superpower must have global military reach. That's the simplest and most common definition used to describe such states. US forces are everywhere, and if they're not, they're close by, just one short C-130 or helicopter ride away from being in your backyard. That is no accident. The U.S. military serves two primary goals: to keep conflict far from American shores and to maintain global stability. When nations aren't fighting, economies thrive. That stability is good for the world and even better for the United States. With the ability to deploy several thousand troops and hundreds of combat aircraft anywhere in the world within 48 hours, few nations have the resources or the nerve to test the global peace largely enforced by U.S. military hegemony. When the U.S. turns isolationist, the global order deteriorates. And when that happens, the U.S. economy suffers, hurting America most of all. Russia and China don't have the capacity to deploy large amounts of military power far from their shores. China is working on this, but its navy remains largely a coastal force, unable to operate far from home without friendly air support. Unlike China, the U.S. Navy brings its own air force to the sea, and it is big enough to rank among the world's largest. In Russia, superpowers don't spend 3 years struggling to take a tenth of their neighbor's territory. But military power is only part of the question. A superpower also needs global financial reach. In this regard, China can challenge the U.S., sort of. While Chinese economic influence has exploded in the last 2 decades, most of global trade is still done in US dollars. Only a tiny percentage is done in Chinese yuan. When the US imposes sanctions on a nation, they don't come alone. They trigger a global pile-on. That's the other side of being a superpower, a worldwide network of allies you directly influence. When the US moves, it almost never moves alone. That's the staggering diplomatic weight of a superpower. The ability to shape global events through soft power alone. China can only do this regionally, and even then, only sometimes. There's also another aspect of superpower status people rarely consider: culture. U.S. culture is global. And while it doesn't have the dominance it once did during the Cold War, it is still a force to be reckoned with. Odds are when you go to the movies, the summer blockbusters you're watching are American-made films with American actors. This is no accident. During the Cold War, one of America's greatest tools against communism was Hollywood. American ideals and values spread better through movies than missiles. No nation today has the sheer cultural might of the United States. Its TV shows, movies, video games, comic books, fashion, and music are global phenomenons. Taking all aspects into consideration, there's only one reigning superpower, and it's not even close: the United States. China may be rising militarily, but its films still struggle to find reliable overseas audiences. Aside from TikTok and maybe Huawei, most of the world would struggle to point out Chinese influence in their daily lives. And yet, America's status as a superpower is being challenged like never before. And in many ways, it's willingly giving up that status through bad domestic decisions. So what would happen if America lost its superpower status? And what could make that happen? To answer that, we need to understand how the U.S. could lose its place at the top. Because in history, every power eventually falls. Economic concerns could trigger the downfall. Chief among these are rising foreign debt and the results of a potential war with China. U.S. debt payments keep climbing each year, forcing Washington to spend more and more on interest. Nations can run deficits for decades, as long as interest doesn't grow faster than the economy itself. But many fear the U.S. has crossed, or soon will cross, the point where debt outpaces growth. Loss of confidence in America's ability to pay its dues could shake global confidence in the dollar and the entire financial system. The economic result of a war with China could be even more devastating than the military one. Losses are predicted to be steep for the U.S., even in victory. The staggering cost of rebuilding a very expensive military could cripple the U.S., especially if the war harms critical infrastructure either physically or digitally. Submarine-launched missiles could target U.S. infrastructure. Cyber attacks could wreak havoc on dams, grids, and supply chains. America's information-driven economy is especially vulnerable. A multi-year war could drain the U.S. militarily and financially, leaving it a husk of its former self. America could also fall behind in the new tech race. AI and energy breakthroughs will define the 21st century. Losing the AI race would be like missing the jet engine or computer revolution in the 20th century. It wouldn't mean collapse, but it would lock the U.S. so far behind that catching up would be nearly impossible. And then there's immigration. Since World War II, America has been a beacon for the world's top scientists, engineers, and artists. Its superpower status was fueled by waves of talented immigrants. But today, more and more are going elsewhere. Canada, Europe, Australia, even China are poaching top talent. Immigration hurdles and limited pathways to residency frustrate or prevent many from staying in the U.S. This threatens the very engine of America's growth. Immigrants aren't just workers, they're innovators. Over half of U.S. billion-dollar startups were founded by immigrants. In 2023 alone, immigrants paid $652 billion in taxes. Yet failed policies and economic stagnation are driving this money and talent away. If America folds on its superpower status, in a word, pandemonium, the dollar would tank as a global reserve currency. Over half of global trade is done in dollars. Transitioning to alternative currencies would spark economic chaos and international competition, possibly even wars. The cost of everyday goods in America would skyrocket, straining a middle class already under pressure. Political turmoil could spiral into civil unrest, or even civil war. The U.S. would also lose leverage over institutions like the IMF and World Bank, weakening its ability to shape global policy or punish aggressors like Russia. Without America, Europe would splinter. Rival blocs would form in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. History shows that when no dominant power enforces peace, wars inevitably follow. Without America's nuclear umbrella, allies would feel exposed. Europe could return to regular wars, as it did for centuries. The 80 years of peace Europe has enjoyed much to U.S. protection. Without it, old rivalries would reignite. Even global trade would collapse into chaos. The Red Sea attacks showed how fragile shipping routes are without U.S. naval dominance. Insurance costs soared, shipping routes lengthened, and global supply chains froze. Critics mock America as the world's cop, but the truth is the world needs that cop. Without it, piracy, extortion, and trade disruptions would become the norm. Since World War II, America has secured global free trade routes. That stability brought down costs, boosted prosperity, and fueled decades of growth. Without it, the world would return to chaos, only worse. What's good for America has often been good for the world. While always acting in its own interest, the U.S. has long seen the value of global prosperity. A stable, prosperous world means fewer wars to police and a stronger U.S. economy. But as America turns inward, putting self-interest above global responsibility, China and Russia would like nothing more than to fill the vacuum. And if America ever lost its superpower status, the consequences could get personal, fast. Imagine waking up one morning to find that the US dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency. Gas prices have doubled overnight. Your weekly groceries now cost 3 times as much, and your government is warning of supply shortages because global shipping routes are collapsing. That may sound like a doomsday scenario ripped straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster, but it's closer to reality than many people want to admit. This isn't just an academic debate. It's a scenario that could completely change your life, wherever you live in the world. The term superpower gets thrown around in the media all the time, usually in reference to America, Russia, or China. But the truth is, not every big country qualifies as one. A true superpower isn't just about having nukes or a big army. It's about global reach, military, economic, diplomatic, and cultural. Since the end of World War II, the United States has been in a league of its own. Even during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union seemed like an equal rival, America had something that no other nation could replicate: a vast, interconnected system of military bases, global trade dominance, financial control, and cultural influence that reached into every corner of the planet. Hollywood movies, Wall Street banks, Silicon Valley technology, and the Pentagon's unmatched military presence all combined to create a power unlike anything the world had ever seen before. But here's the catch. History tells us that no empire, no matter how mighty, lasts forever. Rome fell. The British Empire crumbled. The Soviet Union collapsed almost overnight. Could the same fate await the United States? The military factor. One of the clearest signs of superpower status is the ability to project military power anywhere on Earth. The U.S. doesn't just have the world's largest defense budget. It has the world's most advanced force projection system. American aircraft carriers are essentially floating cities with their own air forces, able to strike targets thousands of miles from U.S. shores. The Air Force can move hundreds of jets across continents within hours. Special operations forces can appear anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. This isn't just about showing off military hardware. The U.S. uses its military to enforce global stability. Whether people like it or not, international trade runs smoothly because U.S. naval ships patrol the world sea lanes. When pirates threaten shipping in the Gulf of Aden, when missiles target cargo ships in the Red Sea, or when rogue states threaten their neighbors, it's usually U.S. forces that step in. But what happens if America can no longer afford to police the world? What happens if its ships can't guarantee safe passage for trillions of dollars worth of global trade? The ripple effects would be devastating. And here's the thing, China and Russia don't have the capability to step into that role. China's navy is growing fast, but it's still largely a regional force, designed to defend its coastline rather than patrol the open oceans. Russia, meanwhile, struggles to maintain even basic control over its own borders, as the drawn-out war in Ukraine has shown. For now, the U.S. is still unmatched militarily, but maintaining that dominance costs trillions, and with debt rising and political gridlock paralyzing Washington, the question is, how long can America sustain its role as the world's policeman? The dollar in global economics. If military power keeps the seas safe, financial power keeps the global economy flowing. Right now, the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. Over 50% of all international trade is conducted in dollars, even when the US itself isn't directly involved. This gives America enormous leverage. If Washington wants to punish a country, say, through sanctions, it doesn't just block that nation from trading with the US. It effectively blocks them from trading with the entire world. That's why US sanctions on countries like Iran, Venezuela, and Russia have been so devastating. But what if the dollar loses its dominance? China has been quietly pushing its currency, the yuan, onto the global stage. Countries like Russia, Brazil, and even some Middle Eastern allies are starting to conduct trade in non-dollar currencies. It's still a tiny fraction compared to the dollar, but the trend is undeniable. If enough countries lose faith in the dollar, or if America's debt spirals so far out of control that investors stop trusting U.S. bonds, the entire system could unravel. The dollar could collapse in value, triggering hyperinflation inside the U.S. itself. The result? Your paycheck buys less and less every week, while global markets spiral into chaos as they scramble to find a new reserve currency. Culture, America's invisible weapon. When people think about power, they usually imagine tanks and missiles. But cultural influence is just as powerful, and in many ways more lasting. From Marvel movies to McDonald's, from hip-hop to TikTok trends, American culture is everywhere. Even in countries that openly criticize the U.S., young people still wear American brands, watch American shows, and listen to American music. During the Cold War, Hollywood was one of America's strongest tools against communism. No missile could convince the world of American ideals as effectively as a blockbuster movie showcasing freedom, wealth, and opportunity. But cultural dominance isn't guaranteed. China has been trying to push its own cultural exports globally, from movies to apps. Bollywood, K-pop, and other regional industries are also carving out massive global audiences. While America still leads the pack, its grip is slipping. And here's the question. If the U.S. loses its cultural influence, will the world still see America as the shining example of freedom and prosperity? Or will another nation step into that spotlight? What could bring the U.S. down? Superpowers don't just collapse out of nowhere. They usually fall because of a combination of internal weakness and external pressure. For America, there are a few key threats that could accelerate its decline. 1. Debt crisis. U.S. national debt is exploding. Interest payments are eating up more of the federal budget every year. Eventually, something has to give. 2. War with China. Even if the U.S. wins a conflict over Taiwan or the South China Sea, the financial and human cost could be so devastating that America never fully recovers. 3. Losing the tech race. If China or another nation wins the race for dominance in artificial intelligence, green energy, or quantum computing, the U.S. could find itself permanently behind. 4. Immigration failures. America's strength has always come from attracting the best minds in the world. If it loses that advantage, innovation slows and economic growth suffers. 5. Domestic division. A superpower can't lead globally if it can't function at home. Political polarization, civil unrest, and even the possibility of secession movements could weaken the U.S. from within. Global trade would collapse into regional blocks. Prices for food, gas, and technology would skyrocket. Countries that have relied on U.S. protection would suddenly find themselves vulnerable, triggering a new wave of arms races and conflicts. Europe could fracture without the NATO umbrella. The Middle East could explode into even more wars. Asia could fall under China's sphere of influence. Africa could become a battleground for rival powers carving up resources. And inside the U.S., the end of dollar dominance would crush the middle class. Unemployment would rise, inflation would skyrocket, and political unrest could spiral into outright violence. The world as we know it would no longer exist. But here's the most terrifying part. Some signs suggest this collapse has already begun. We explored what it really means to be a superpower. Military dominance, economic control, cultural influence, and the ability to shape world events. We also asked the big question, what happens if America loses that status? Now, let's go deeper into the economic side of the collapse. Because if the military is America's sword, the dollar is its shield. And if the dollar cracks, everything else falls apart. The dollar, America's secret weapon. Most Americans don't think about it when they buy groceries or fill up their gas tank, but the US dollar runs the world. Over 50% of global trade is done in dollars. Oil is priced in dollars. International loans are written in dollars. Central banks from Europe to Asia stockpile dollars as reserves. This means when Washington prints money, the world absorbs it. When Washington spends beyond its means, the world pays for it. And when Washington imposes sanctions, other countries feel the pain. That's an incredible advantage, but it's also a fragile one, because the system only works if the rest of the world trusts the dollar. And right now, cracks are starting to appear. The debt time bomb. America's national debt has exploded past $35 trillion, and it's climbing fast. Every year, the government spends more on interest payments than on education or infrastructure. In theory, debt isn't always bad. As long as your economy keeps growing, you can handle it. But what happens when the debt grows faster than the economy? At some point, investors, foreign governments, banks, even regular people may start asking, will the U.S. ever pay this back? If confidence breaks, the dollar could collapse almost overnight. Investors might dump U.S. bonds, central banks could shift to other currencies, and the greenback could lose its global dominance. For ordinary Americans, that means skyrocketing inflation. Your savings evaporate. Your paycheck buys less every week, and imported goods, everything from electronics to medicine, become unaffordable. For the world, it means chaos. Countries that rely on dollars for trade would scramble for alternatives. Rival currencies like the Chinese yuan, the euro, or even cryptocurrencies might step in. But no single system is ready to replace the dollar smoothly. The transition would be brutal. China's silent strategy. China knows it can't take down America militarily, at least not yet. But economically, that's another story. Beijing has been building something called the Belt and Road Initiative, a vast network of trade routes, investments, and infrastructure projects linking Asia, Africa, and Europe. The goal? To pull more countries into China's economic orbit and encourage them to trade in yuan instead of dollars. At the same time, China is stockpiling gold, signing deals with oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia, and pushing its currency in international markets. So far, the dollar is still king, but the cracks are widening. Every trade deal done in yuan instead of dollars chips away at America's financial supremacy. And if a major global crisis, say a U.S. debt default, ever shakes confidence in the dollar, China will be ready to step in. Everyday life without dollar dominance. It's easy to think of all this as abstract economics. But let's bring it down to earth. What happens to you if the dollar falls? Gas prices explode. Oil is priced in dollars. If the dollar weakens, oil becomes more expensive worldwide. Filling your tank could cost triple what it does today. Food becomes a luxury. Global supply chains depend on the dollar. A collapse would make imports wildly expensive, raising food prices everywhere. A simple loaf of bread could cost $10 or more. Savings evaporate. Inflation eats away at bank accounts. Retirement funds lose value. The money you worked for your whole life could vanish in months. Jobs disappear. As global trade contracts, U.S. companies would struggle. Outsourcing, layoffs, and bankruptcies would become the norm. And remember, this isn't just about America. If the dollar falls, the whole world suffers. Countries in Africa, Asia, and South America that rely on dollar-based loans and trade would be devastated. The collapse of the dollar wouldn't just be an American problem. It would trigger a global depression worse than anything the world has seen before. Could technology save America? But here's a twist. While the dollar looks vulnerable, America still holds one trump card: technology. The U.S. leads the world in artificial intelligence, biotech, green energy, and space exploration. Silicon Valley is still the beating heart of innovation. If America can stay ahead in these fields, it may offset economic decline by creating new industries, new jobs, and new forms of global dominance. Think of how the internet transformed the world in the 1990s, an American invention that gave Washington enormous influence. But the competition is fierce. China is investing billions in AI, 5G, and quantum computing. Europe is racing to dominate green energy. The battle for tech supremacy could decide not just who leads in innovation, but who controls the future economy. If America falls behind, the consequences could be just as severe as losing the dollar. Immigration, the forgotten key. There's another hidden factor that could make or break America's future: immigration. For over a century, America has been the world's magnet for talent. Scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs. Many of the greatest minds of the modern era came to the U.S. because it offered opportunities no other nation could. More than half of America's billion-dollar startups were founded by immigrants. In 2023 alone, immigrants contributed over $650 billion in taxes. But today, immigration policies are tightening, pathways to residency are shrinking, and many skilled workers are choosing other destinations: Canada, Europe, Australia, even China. If America loses this flow of talent, it loses its edge. No matter how powerful its military or dollar is, innovation slows down and growth stalls. The question is, will the U.S. embrace its history as a land of opportunity, or turn inward, cutting itself off from the very fuel that made it a superpower? The domino effect. Let's imagine for a moment that all these factors collide. The U.S. debt spirals out of control. Confidence in the dollar collapses. China's yuan gains global traction. Immigration slows, draining America's talent pool. And rival nations catch up in technology. The result wouldn't just be a weaker America. It would be a world plunged into chaos. Global shipping routes could fracture as the U.S. Navy retreats. Regional powers would scramble for dominance. Wars over resources could erupt in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Europe could break apart without U.S. protection. And everyday people from New York to Nairobi would feel the impact in their wallets, their jobs, and their safety. The fall of a superpower isn't just a headline. It's a tidal wave that crashes over the entire planet. Because when the world's only true superpower steps back, it doesn't just weaken America. It destabilizes the entire planet. The global cop dilemma. For decades, critics have accused the United States of being the world's policeman. U.S. troops are stationed in over 70 countries. American naval fleets patrol every major ocean. Military alliances like NATO, defense treaties with Japan and South Korea, and security guarantees to nations across the globe all depend on American power. This comes at a massive cost. Trillions of dollars spent. Countless lives lost in conflicts from Vietnam to Iraq. And political blowback at home, where many argue America should focus inward instead of policing the world. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The world needs a cop. Without one, chaos takes over. And like it or not, no other nation has the reach, the logistics, or the alliances to replace the United States. So what happens if America hangs up its badge? The vacuum of power. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does geopolitics. If America retreats, someone else will try to fill the void. But who? China? It's the obvious candidate, with a massive economy and growing military. But China lacks a true network of allies. Its diplomacy is transactional, not relational. And many of its neighbors, from India to Japan to Vietnam, fear Chinese dominance. Russia? Militarily aggressive, but economically fragile. Russia struggles to maintain influence even in its own backyard. It's more likely to cause instability than enforce peace. The European Union? Strong economies, advanced militaries, and a tradition of diplomacy. But the EU lacks unity. Internal divisions, Brexit-style exits, and conflicting national interests make it nearly impossible for Europe to act as one cohesive superpower. The United Nations? In theory, a global peacekeeper. In reality, toothless without U.S. backing. The UN can pass resolutions, but it has no military muscle to enforce them. The harsh reality is this. If America falls, there may not be a single replacement. Instead, the world fractures into competing regional powers, each enforcing their own rules, and clashing violently when interests collide. The return of regional wars. For the last 80 years, major wars between great powers have been avoided. That's no coincidence. It's because the U.S. military, with its unmatched global presence, has acted as a deterrent. But without that deterrent, history suggests wars would return with alarming frequency. Europe. For centuries, Europe was the bloodiest battlefield on Earth. From the Napoleonic Wars to World War II, conflict was constant. Since World War II, peace has held largely because of NATO and the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Without it, old rivalries could re-emerge, especially with a resurgent Russia at the borders. The Middle East, already unstable, the region depends heavily on U.S. military presence to secure trade routes and deter aggression. Without American bases in the Gulf, nations like Iran could expand influence unchecked, sparking new conflicts. Asia, China and India are already competing for dominance. Without U.S. alliances in the Pacific, countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan would face enormous pressure to militarize. A new arms race would be inevitable. Africa, with vast resources and weak central governance, Africa could become the battleground for proxy wars between China, Russia, and regional powers. The U.S. military currently suppresses piracy and terrorism there. Without it, instability spreads. The end of U.S. dominance wouldn't bring peace. It would bring a return to the kind of brutal, frequent wars that defined most of human history. Nuclear nightmares. Perhaps the scariest consequence of America's decline is nuclear proliferation. Right now, many countries rely on the U.S. for protection. Japan, South Korea, Germany, Saudi Arabia. These nations could all build nuclear weapons, but they haven't. Why? Because they trust America's security guarantees. If that trust disappears, the nuclear club could grow overnight. Dozens of countries would rush to build their own deterrents, sparking a dangerous new nuclear arms race. The risk of accidents, miscalculations, or intentional strikes would rise dramatically. A single mistake could plunge the world into nuclear catastrophe. Pirates, terrorists, and criminal states. The U.S. Navy doesn't just deter other superpowers. It also keeps trade routes open by suppressing piracy, smuggling, and terrorism on the high seas. Take the recent Red Sea crisis, where Houthi rebels launched missile attacks on commercial ships. Insurance costs for shipping skyrocketed. Some companies rerouted thousands of miles around Africa, and global supply chains froze. Now imagine that happening on every ocean with no U.S. Navy to intervene. Shipping insurance would become unaffordable, goods would move slower and cost far more, and criminal groups could extort entire regions. Terrorist organizations, too, would find it easier to carve out safe havens. Without U.S. drones, special forces, and intelligence networks, extremist groups could grow unchecked, exporting violence across borders. The end of U.S. superpower status doesn't mean more freedom. It means more lawlessness. Alliances in crisis. Another overlooked effect of America's decline is the collapse of global alliances. NATO, the most powerful military alliance in history, depends almost entirely on U.S. funding and leadership. Without America, NATO is a hollow shell. Europe would splinter, with nations turning inward or cutting their own deals with Russia and China. Pacific allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan all rely on U.S. security guarantees. Without them, these nations face a stark choice: build massive militaries or bow to China's dominance. Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states all depend on U.S. backing to deter Iran. Without it, the region would spiral into chaos, with new wars breaking out in days. When alliances collapse, nations act alone. And when nations act alone, the world becomes far more dangerous. A preview of the future. We've already seen hints of this world. In Syria, when the U.S. pulled back, Russia filled the vacuum, and chaos spread. In Afghanistan, the U.S. exit allowed the Taliban to seize control in weeks. In Ukraine, Russia gambled that America wouldn't intervene directly, and it was right. Each of these events is a preview of what a post-American world could look like. More violence, more instability, more suffering. And yet, there are those who argue that America's retreat is inevitable, or even desirable. That the world would be better off without one nation dominating. But would it really? Or would the collapse of U.S. superpower status unleash a nightmare that no one is ready for? But what about inside America itself? Because losing superpower status isn't just about other nations rising. It's also about what happens at home, on Main Street, in small towns, in big cities, and in the halls of government. And here's the chilling reality. The greatest threats to America may not come from abroad, but from within. The shock to the American psyche. For generations, Americans have grown up believing their country is the most powerful in the world. From Hollywood to history textbooks, the idea of American exceptionalism is woven into the culture. But what happens if that belief collapses? Psychologists call it an identity crisis, a loss of confidence not just in leadership, but in the very story of who we are. If America is no longer the shining city on a hill, then what is it? This crisis of identity could trigger a wave of anger, despair, and political extremism. Citizens might demand drastic action, either to rebuild America's power or to tear down the system entirely. The rise of political extremes. Even today, American politics is polarized. The left and right often seem to live in different realities. If the U.S. loses superpower status, that polarization could explode into something much worse. One side may demand radical nationalism, closing borders, rejecting global trade, and ramping up military spending in a desperate attempt to restore dominance. The other side may push for radical isolationism, arguing that America should retreat entirely, abandon foreign entanglements, and focus solely on domestic issues. The clash between these visions could paralyze government, or even lead to widespread unrest. And history teaches us something chilling. Empires rarely go quietly. They collapse with turmoil, civil wars, and revolutions. Economic pain at home. The financial consequences of losing superpower status would hit American households hard. Job losses. Without global dominance, U.S. companies lose their edge. Manufacturing could collapse further. High-paying tech and finance jobs could shift overseas, and unemployment could rise dramatically. Inflation and shortages. A weaker dollar makes imports more expensive. Everyday goods, from smartphones to groceries, would cost more. Supply chains could falter without U.S. naval protection, leading to scarcity. Decline of the middle class. Already shrinking, the middle class would be squeezed even tighter. Housing becomes unaffordable, healthcare costs skyrocket, and social mobility declines. National debt crisis. With fewer nations buying U.S. bonds, America would face skyrocketing interest rates. Debt payments could overwhelm the budget, forcing deep cuts to Medicare, Social Security, and public services. The result? A population that feels betrayed, abandoned, and angry. The military paradox. Here's an irony. Even as America weakens, its military might still be the largest in the world, but it would no longer be sustainable. The Pentagon's budget already exceeds $800 billion a year. If the economy falters, maintaining hundreds of overseas bases and advanced weapons programs will be nearly impossible. This creates a dangerous paradox. The U.S. might have nuclear weapons and aircraft carriers, but lack the money, morale, or political unity to use them effectively. And when great powers keep vast arsenals but lose global authority, history shows us what happens next. Instability, coups, or reckless wars born of desperation. Social fragmentation. Beyond politics and economics lies another threat, the breakdown of social unity. Already, divisions run deep. Urban versus rural, coastal versus heartland, conservative versus progressive. Add the pressure of economic decline, and those divisions widen into dangerous rifts. Secession movements. States like Texas or California might push for independence if they believe Washington can no longer provide stability. Civil unrest. Protests could turn violent, with militias, gangs, or extremist groups seizing power in local regions. Cultural collapse. With America no longer setting the global tone in music, film, tech, or fashion, cultural influence shrinks. Citizens begin to feel not just economically poorer, but culturally irrelevant. The dream of unity, the idea of the United States, starts to fracture. Technology and brain drain. America's greatest strength has long been its ability to attract the best minds. from scientists fleeing war-torn Europe during World War II to modern-day tech entrepreneurs. Innovation has flowed into the U.S. But what happens when the world sees America as a declining power? Talent exodus. The best engineers, doctors, and inventors might choose China, Europe, or rising nations instead. Tech decline. Without dominance in semiconductors, AI, or biotech, America could fall behind, just as Britain fell behind the US a century ago. Space race reversal. Once a pioneer, NASA could lose funding, while nations like China and India leap ahead in space exploration. For the first time in modern history, the US might no longer be the hub of innovation. A world without the American dream. Finally, there's the cultural impact. The idea of the American dream, that anyone can rise, anyone can succeed, has inspired billions. Immigrants risk everything to come to America because they believe in that promise. If America loses its superpower status, that dream begins to die. Immigration slows. Innovation fades. Patriotism weakens. The world stops looking at America with admiration and starts looking at it with pity. So far, we've seen what losing superpower status means on the global stage and at home. But there's still one question we've avoided. The question many consider impossible. Yet history says otherwise. Could the United States of America cease to exist as a single nation? It may sound like science fiction, but remember, the Soviet Union was once a nuclear-armed superpower too. It collapsed in 1991, not because of an enemy invasion, but because of internal fractures it could no longer hide. And the US, despite its unmatched power, is not immune to the same fate. The cracks in the Union. America is often called a melting pot, but in reality, it's more like a collection of rival tribes held together by a shared story. The belief in the American dream, freedom, and prosperity. When that story fades, the glue weakens, and the cracks are already visible. Political divides. States vote radically differently. Red versus blue isn't just political. It's cultural, economic, and even moral. Economic disparities. Wealth is concentrated on the coasts, while much of the interior feels abandoned. This fuels resentment and anger at Washington elites. Cultural battles. Debates over identity, rights, and values have become wars of ideology. Neither side trusts the other. Now imagine adding the shock of America losing its superpower status. Suddenly, the one thing everyone agreed on, that America is the greatest nation on Earth, disappears. What's left to hold the Union together? Secession movements, from fringe to mainstream. For years, secession has been seen as a fringe fantasy. But if America declines, those fantasies may gain momentum. Texas already prides itself on independence. With its own energy resources, ports, and culture, some Texans argue the state could survive, even thrive, on its own. California. With the world's fifth largest economy, California already functions like a nation-state. If Washington loses credibility, Californians could push to go it alone. Other states and regions, the Midwest might band together around agriculture. The South could revive Confederate nostalgia. The Pacific Northwest has flirted with secessionist ideas. Individually, these movements are small. But in times of crisis, small sparks can ignite massive fires. Civil unrest and fragmentation. Even without official secession, unrest could shatter the U.S. from within. Armed militias. Already active across the country, militias could grow into regional powers if federal authority weakens. City versus countryside. Urban areas may clash with rural ones, each demanding different governance. Resource wars. Water in the West, oil in the South, agriculture in the Midwest. Resources could become flashpoints for conflict. What starts as protest could escalate into armed conflict. And with millions of weapons already in civilian hands, any internal breakdown could be catastrophic. The nuclear question. Here's the nightmare scenario. If the U.S. fractures, who controls the nuclear arsenal? Right now, launch codes are centralized under the president. But if the government collapses, or if states openly rebel, could rogue commanders seize weapons? Could America's own arsenal become the greatest threat to its survival? This isn't just a domestic issue. The entire world would panic if America's nuclear weapons seemed insecure. Allies would scramble to defend themselves. Enemies might strike first to eliminate the risk. The very weapons meant to guarantee safety could instead accelerate the nation's downfall. The fall of the United States. If America splits, the consequences are unimaginable. Global economy in free fall. The US dollar collapses completely. Global trade grinds to chaos. NATO dissolves overnight. Without a unified America, Europe is exposed to Russian pressure. China steps in. With the US fractured, China could claim superpower status uncontested, reshaping the world order in its image. New borders, new wars. Former US states might fight over territory, resources, or ideology. Refugee crises could erupt within what used to be America's own borders. It wouldn't just be the end of US dominance. It would be the end of America itself. The final question. And yet, even as this dark scenario unfolds, a haunting question lingers. Is collapse inevitable? Or could America adapt, reform, and rise again stronger, leaner, and more united? Because history shows something important. Some empires fall forever, but others reinvent themselves. So is America destined to fracture like Rome and the Soviet Union? Or could it stage the greatest comeback the world has ever seen? Lessons from history. History is filled with empires that believe they would last forever. Rome, the Ottomans, the British Empire, the Soviet Union. Each had unmatched power in their time. Each thought themselves invincible. And each collapsed when internal weaknesses combined with external pressures. But there's another side to history. Some nations, when faced with crisis, adapt. They reinvent themselves. They shed what no longer works and rebuild something stronger. Which side of history will America fall on? The case for collapse. The warning signs are real. Debt spirals, political dysfunction, cultural divides, and a reliance on military dominance that may not be sustainable. If these trends continue unchecked, collapse seems not just possible, but likely. And the cost wouldn't just be America's. The entire world would feel the quake. Allies would scramble. Enemies would rise. Ordinary people everywhere would suffer the ripple effects of a fractured superpower. The case for renewal. But there's another path. America still has strengths no other nation can match. Diversity of talent. Immigrants continue to bring skills, ideas, and innovation. Resources, vast farmland, energy reserves, and natural wealth. Technology. The U.S. still leads in AI, biotech, and space exploration. Resilience. Every time America has faced crisis, from the Civil War to the Great Depression to World War II, it has bounced back. Decline is not destiny. America could choose reform instead of collapse, unity instead of division, adaptation instead of arrogance. The fork in the road. So, what happens if America loses its superpower status? One path leads to fragmentation, chaos, and the end of the United States as we know it. The other path leads to reinvention, a leaner but still powerful America, one that learns from its mistakes and builds a new role in the world. Which path is taken will depend on choices made today, by leaders, by institutions, and by ordinary citizens. The fall of superpowers is rarely sudden. It's slow, creeping, and often ignored until it's too late. But that also means there's time. Time to change course. Time to rebuild trust. Time to reinvent the dream that first made America great. If America falls, the world falls with it. But if America rises again, if it transforms instead of collapses, it could once again inspire billions. The question is not just whether America will remain a superpower. The real question is, will America remember why it became one in the first place? Let's know your thought on this on comment section. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share our channel. Life Facts Daily.